to understand the process of evolution, you just need to think about these 4 simple points. Number 1, most characteristics are inherited. Number 2, some characteristics are not inherited. Number 3, life in nature is hard. And number 4, the earth is old. When these 4 elements come together, it's logical that evolution inevitably follows. Let me show you what I mean by looking at each of them in more detail. The first is that most characteristics are inherited. If you think of yourself as an example, you might have your dad's nose or your mum's eyes. Without going into too much detail, our DNA is made up from parts of our mothers and parts of our fathers, so we get a mix of both. The second point is that some characteristics are not inherited. Although organisms have systems which are very good at copying DNA accurately, there's so much information that mistakes do inevitably occasionally happen. These are called genetic mutations, and they can lead to characteristics which came from neither the mother nor the father. Most mutations cause very small changes, often too small to really impact on that individual's life. But occasionally a mutation happens which does impact, and common examples of these include being slightly more or less likely to develop a given disease, or differences in height or hair colour. It's important to note that there's no blueprint or aim or force behind these mutations, they're just random. They're errors in the code. Very occasionally, as we'll see, these errors can, just by chance, give an individual a slight advantage. The third point is that life in nature is hard. It's really easy for us to forget this. Most of us today live lives in which we are protected from the harshness of nature. We have heated houses and plenty of food and clean water and medicine and lots of other things. But these are all very recent. Most animals who've ever lived, including most humans, have been struck down by one thing or another before they ever had a chance to pass on their genes. In nature there is a very fine line between life and death, and small things can make the difference between dying early or living long enough to reproduce. Think of animals like frogs, which lay thousands of eggs, but usually only 1 or 2 of those, the very best adapted, will survive long enough to reproduce. All the others will die early. The fourth and final point is that the Earth is old. The Earth is old, very old, somewhere around 4.5 billion years old, and life emerged around 3.5 billion years ago. This is important for understanding evolution as it is a very slow process, and life could only have produced all the diversity we see around us if it had a long time to gradually mutate and change. Now I'll put these 4 elements together in an example situation. Here are 2 islands. Let's say they're about 300 miles apart. On the southern island lives a population of birds, and on the northern island there are no birds. One year, a storm occurs and blows a flock of birds from the southern island way off course, and they arrive on the northern island. They reproduce in their new home, and soon both islands have large populations of the same species of bird. In all these many families of birds across both islands, the same kinds of things are happening as you see in your own family and as we discussed before. Male and female birds pass on their features to their young. Sometimes a mutation happens and a bird is born with, for example, a slightly longer beak, or a slightly longer left leg, or just slightly more feathers. One year the northern island experiences unusually cold weather. It's way too cold for these birds as they're equipped for the warmer temperatures of the southern island. Nearly all the birds die apart from a very few who happen to have been born with slightly more feathers which keep them just that little bit warmer. So here's an example of a small variation caused by a mutation being the difference between life and death. When spring comes, these birds start looking for a mate, and the only partners available are others with slightly larger than average feathers. So they pass on this trait just as your parents passed on their traits to you, and the next generation, on average, have slightly more feathers than their ancestors did. The difference over one generation would be very, very small, but what about over 100 generations, or 1,000, or 10,000? And what if the winters got colder and colder on the northern island? You can see over time how birds on the northern island would become quite different from those on the southern island. And all the time, all that's happening is birds which survive long enough to reproduce pass on their genes, and birds which die early don't, and their genes die with them. If enough time passes, the 2 groups of birds would become so different that they could no longer interbreed. This is one of the things which indicates that they'd become a new species. There are examples in nature which are really similar to this. But sometimes it's different in that rather than the temperature changing, something else changes, like a new predator comes in, or a new type of food becomes available, or a new place to hide from predators is discovered. Useful characteristics get passed on because they help their owners survive long enough to reproduce in their environment. So what we've looked at there is what's called natural selection. But natural selection could never have produced some of the things we see in nature, such as the peacock's feathers, which actually make its life much harder, or a mandrill's face, which makes it easier for predators to spot. How could these things have evolved? Characteristics like these are produced by what's called sexual selection. These are passed on from one generation to the next, not because they've made life easier, but because they attract the opposite sex. Think of this example again with birds. Here are two male birds. This one has a crest of feathers on his head and quite long tail feathers. This one's tail and crest are slightly smaller and they're both a bit disappointing. This female bird happens to have a slight preference for longer tails and mates with this male. This female either doesn't care about feathers or has a slight preference for smaller feathers. What the female birds didn't know is that the reason this male had lusher, fuller feathers is because he's really good at gathering food and therefore healthy enough to produce those feathers. So they mate and their chicks will be well fed and they'll be likely to inherit his long feathers and her preference for long feathers. Meanwhile, this male was bad at finding food. He became unhealthy and that's why his feathers were a bit raggedy. He isn't good at finding food for his young either, and some of them become sick and they die before they have a chance to reproduce. All those males with smaller tail feathers and those females who preferred smaller tail feathers gave birth to young which died before they had a chance to reproduce, so those genes disappeared from the population. Soon the whole population is made up of males with long tail feathers and females who like long tail feathers. In fact, as far as these females are concerned, the longer the tail, the better. So when a mutation happens and a young male hatches with an exceptionally long tail, he's very popular, he has lots of opportunities to reproduce, and he sends his genes on to the next generation. Whereas his brothers and cousins who weren't so lucky didn't send their genes on as much, and so the process continues. Over many generations, again long periods of time are necessary, this simple process can produce astonishing variety and beauty. As well as feather length, sexual selection can affect anything like colour, shape and even behaviour, such as in courtship displays. All the time this process is happening with no intention, destiny or blueprint guiding it. The natural world we see around us is the product of countless individual stories of survival or death, which when put together produce an incredibly elaborate tapestry, the future of which is unwritten. You yourself are a part of this tapestry. The web of life connects you to every living thing you see around you. And as a final thought, you can go to an ancient castle or ruin to look at the history of human civilizations, but to look at your own personal evolutionary history, you just need to look in the mirror. All of your features, including, for example, your ears, develop the particular shape and character they have because they helped every one of your ancestors stay alive long enough to reproduce. And all of those strange and unknowable creatures which came before you have left their mark on your body.